Hi, I'm Andrew Joseph Keith, and this is the Proco Figure Sculpting Fundamentals course. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to use study boards to practice things like texture, anatomy, bas-relief, and facial features. Using study boards also makes it easier to mold and cast if you create a sculpture that you want to keep. These study boards will serve a similar purpose as a sketchbook. These are tools to help us practice principles and techniques that help us improve our knowledge and skills with whatever medium we're working in. These usually aren't intended to be finished works of art, but the techniques that we learn and the ideas that we develop can inform our other artworks. These study boards will help us practice building things out in 3D. But you should still have a sketchbook because drawing is an important skill for sculptors. One thing I like about study boards is it doesn't require a lot of materials. All you need is a board and some clay. For the board, you can use a plywood panel around 1/2 inch thick and cut into whatever size you want. I like to have larger boards around 12 inches by 12 inches and some smaller boards around 3 inches by 3 inches for things like practicing the ears, the nose, the mouth, eyes, etc. If I cut the wood myself, I like to sand it to keep little splinters of wood from breaking off into the clay. Sometimes I'll apply a sealant to the wood, like linseed oil or a polyurethane sealer, but it's not necessary. If you do use a sealant, just be sure that it's dry before you start adding clay to the board. Linseed oil usually takes a day or two to totally dry out. If you don't want to use a plywood board, you can also use a cheap clipboard, a plate, or even floor samples that you might get at your local hardware store. On the study board, you can add a thin layer of clay from the beginning, or you can just add pieces of clay onto the study board to build out the sculpture. To apply a layer of clay to the board, we can warm up all the clay and spread a thin layer by hand or with a tool, then use a heat gun to melt the clay into the surface so that it's firmly attached. We can use a metal spatula to even out the surface. I usually want at least 1/4 inch of thickness so that when I'm practicing with the tools, I don't scrape away all the clay and get down to the board. If possible, set your study board on a table at about a 45-degree angle in front of you. An easy way to do this is by stacking some books on the desk behind the board and placing some clay at the bottom edge so that it doesn't slip forward. Then place a light from above and behind the board. Having good lighting will help you see the forms more clearly. This is especially important when you're sculpting a bas-relief, which is a sculpting style where the design is only slightly raised from the background. For the smaller 3-inch by 3-inch study boards, I usually skip the step of putting down a thin, consistent layer of clay and just start to add clay to build out the sculpture on the surface of the board. On these study boards, we can create a bas-relief, a mid-relief, or a high-relief sculpture, which is basically when the elements jump out from the surface and retain their basic proportions. Once we have an even surface, then we can start to add clay to build out the forms. As we talked about in the lesson on building out the sculpture, start by rolling tiny cylinders, like tiny snakes, and then add these one at a time to build out the forms. This helps us be more precise with where we add mass. Think about it like paying more attention to the line work of a drawing, so that each stroke is intentional and well thought out. Even though we're building the sculpture off a flat surface, we still want to think first about the primary forms underneath. Then place the secondary forms, and then finish with the details. If I was sculpting a mouth, for example, I wouldn't start with the lips. Instead, I would first establish the mass of the tooth cylinder talked about in the portrait drawing course. When looking at the skull, you can see how much the teeth come forward, and that's what creates the primary form of the mouth. On top of this primary form, we would then build out the lips as secondary forms. Remember that another big mistake that beginners make is they don't practice the things that they struggle with nearly enough. For example, I used to really struggle with the facial features, so I forced myself to do one a day for a few weeks. Now, I'm not perfect at sculpting the features, but I'm much better than I was. You'd be surprised just how fast you can improve with consistent daily practice. Some common things that people tend to struggle with are the hands, any of the facial features, the feet, anatomy, like the back, all those muscles, looks weird, skin texture, texturing, clothing, drapery, all of these things. There's a lot to work on. Choose one thing and then set aside some time on a regular basis to work on that weakness. And where are you going to work on the weakness? Boom, on your study board. Another great exercise with a study board is doing a bas relief or low relief sculpture of an anatomy tracing from the anatomy course. In a future lesson, I'll go over a bunch of sculpting exercises that will help you master the medium, and a lot of them you can do on a study board, so look out for that. Your assignment is to find or make a few study boards and start practicing. In the premium course, we're going to go over some principles of low relief sculpture, also called bas relief. There's additional demos, 3D models, and much more, plus that warm fuzzy feeling of knowing that you're helping us and everything we do here at Proco. So go check out the full course at proco.com/sculpture. See you there.